Every year, millions of people are trafficked worldwide, including within the United States. The State Department has an office dedicated to saving potential victims. Kari Johnstone is the acting director of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. Kari, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
You know, a lot of people have an idea of what human trafficking is. What is it actually?
So human trafficking is fundamentally a crime of exploitation. Traffickers are exploiting other people for labor or commercial sex. And they're doing so through what we call force, fraud, or coercion. So fundamentally, it is about making someone either work or engage in commercial sex against their will.
And who is most vulnerable to becoming a victim?
So sadly, almost anyone is vulnerable. It's a crime that occurs virtually everywhere in the world. You noted that it's a problem in the United States as well. We find that particularly vulnerable people are those that don't necessarily have a good support system. So often minorities or underserved communities may be particularly targeted. Women and children often may be targeted. Also sexual minorities, LGBTQI individuals as well, people with disabilities. Sadly, traffickers find ways to exploit all kinds of people and take advantage of vulnerabilities or lack of support that people may have.
And the Ukraine war has probably, tragically made those people very ripe for trafficking. So what's going on there?
So you're right, any conflict or any time that people are on the move, they may be even more vulnerable to trafficking, often because they don't have that support system that they may have at home. They may not speak the language, they might not have work or family or know who they can turn to for good advice about how to stay safe. We are very concerned that Russia's war on Ukraine has made the people both in Ukraine and those that have been fleeing Ukraine, Ukrainians and others, third country nationals as well, even more vulnerable to trafficking. We're particularly nervous about the fact that approximately 90% of the people who have fled Ukraine because of Russia's war are women and children, and they're particularly vulnerable anywhere in the world. So we are very worried about that. We're very encouraged by the fast, coordinated, and really serious efforts that the government of Ukraine and governments throughout Europe and the region, especially in the neighboring states, immediately started taking to try to protect Ukrainians and those fleeing the war. And that included a lot of information and awareness raising about things that Ukrainians and those fleeing the war could do to keep themselves safe, like keeping their passports, keeping their cell phones, not giving them to someone. Those governments and also international organizations like the UNHCR or the International Organization for Migration also put steps in place to register. We all, I think, found it really heartwarming to see how many people open their hearts and homes to Ukrainians and those fleeing the war, and also people coming and volunteering, flooding to the borders to offer transportation and housing. We also, from a trafficking perspective, saw a lot of risk in those circumstances. So we were really pleased to see that governments and international organizations were quickly putting steps in place to register the volunteers and people offering both transportation and housing for those individuals that were fleeing the war, so that we could make sure that it was safe people that really did have good intentions to try to keep them safe.
Is your office doing anything to help those refugees? I'm assuming there's not much that can be done for those that are still in Ukraine.
Well, we're actually working within Ukraine as well. We have been working with an international organization for several years to build the Ukrainian government capacity and civil society, because civil society also has an important role to play to keep people safe. And then once victims are exploited by traffickers, civil society and governments work together to identify those victims and get them the care that they need. So we have been working in Ukraine. You're right, it's a difficult circumstance given the ongoing war there. Our office has also been working with our colleagues throughout the State Department and our embassies all around, especially within Europe, but also as we see Ukrainians are moving further and further away as the war lingers, to both alert governments, help build their capacity. We saw, for example, the government of Poland increased its patrolling of police along the border when the Ukrainians and others were leaving the country. So we've been providing foreign assistance as well, both to help build the government capacity as well as civil society capacity throughout the region.
And this isn't your only overseas effort. You have an office called the Program, or you created a program to end modern slavery. What is that? What's it about?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is actually a congressional initiative that is one of our showcase programs that's called, as you said, the Program to End Modern Slavery. It is really focused on cutting-edge research to understand the scope of the problem and be able to measurably reduce human trafficking within specific populations or countries where we're working. So one of the things that we're really excited about within the broader anti-trafficking field, there has long been a lot of programming and efforts that people have made, but we haven't had really good research to understand what's working and frankly even the scope of the problem. It's a hidden crime. A lot of times trafficking victims don't come forward. It's often happening in ways that aren't easy to measure. So we've been investing a lot in cutting edge research, working with academics and other experts so that we can better understand the scope of the problem and then actually measure what is working. As we all are trying very hard to end this problem.
You mentioned that victims are very reluctant to come forward. Obviously, they've been victimized, but what are the ways that you can get them to come forward so that you can go after the perpetrators and end this?
Yeah, that's a really important point and question. Thanks so much for asking it. A lot of victims, they may not be able to come forward, or they may be afraid of coming forward. A lot of times their traffickers lie to them and tell them that if they do come forward and report the crime, that they themselves may be arrested or deported if they're in another country, especially illegally. Sadly, that does often happen, that when victims are not identified, they often may actually be punished more often than the traffickers themselves. So governments have an important role to play in proactively looking for victims of trafficking, because they're not like, someone was assaulted or had their purse stolen, they may go report it to the police. Trafficking victims are not likely to do that. So governments, usually working with civil society, can work to help find those victims. For example, in the United States, the Department of Health and Human Services funds our national trafficking hotline. And that's where people can call if they themselves think they might have been a victim, or they know someone, or they saw something that might be suspicious. And that's one of the really important ways in the United States, for example, that we identify trafficking victims.
Kari, how has the internet changed the way people are trafficked?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and one that is very much on the minds of those of us that are fighting human trafficking. We have seen that traffickers increasingly use the internet to find and target human traffickers. We've all heard about recruiting that happens online that can be related to human trafficking. Unfortunately, we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic a real increase in online recruitment for trafficking. Really bloomed. It was already a problem, but it really increased dramatically during the pandemic. We've also seen increasingly that the crime of human trafficking itself, the actual exploitation, especially of sex trafficking, is happening online. So we see cases where often even children, they may never even leave their home, that they may be victims of sex trafficking online. And we're happy to see that governments are building their capacity, but it is really a growing problem, and one that we're all working to try to figure out how we can address.
I wonder if social media companies are doing anything to help stop this.
Yeah, they're increasingly taking steps to try to keep people safe online and putting in some protections. Like governments and everyone else, they can certainly do more. We were really encouraged to see in September in Seattle, Tech Against Trafficking hosted its first summit, and they brought together the tech industry, other private sector, government, some international organizations, civil society, and survivors of human trafficking. For the first time, bringing them all together to really think about not only what harm can be done on the internet and through social media in terms of trafficking and harm to the victims, but also how the internet and social media can be used for good to help both fight the traffickers, prosecute the traffickers, and also, even more importantly, find and care for the victims.
I wonder what the trends have been. You've been working in this field for many years. What have you seen?
So one of the trends that we've seen is just that, in terms of online trafficking, especially sex trafficking, increasing. We did see, unfortunately, during the pandemic that as government resources may have been directed to addressing the pandemic, and that a lot of people, both their livelihoods may have been affected by the pandemic, that vulnerabilities increased and traffickers have adapted and really took advantage of that during the pandemic. One way is the increase of online trafficking. We've also seen an increase in forced criminality over the last several years, whereby traffickers force someone, again through forced fraud or coercion, to engage in criminal behavior. So that might look like drug-related activity, cultivation or transportation, or other kinds of forced criminality that sadly seems to be a growing phenomenon.
I wonder who these traffickers are, actually. I mean, who are the perpetrators?
So they're varied. As I said, it can happen almost anywhere, including in the United States. Often it may be large organized criminal organizations that are engaging in this, but it also can be individuals, for example, employers who abuse their domestic workers. They might be people that are, maids or nannies in their home, or home health care workers that may be subjected just by their employer, so not a large organization. They might be owners of small businesses or farms. We see that agriculture and construction, for example, are two industries that are particularly vulnerable to human trafficking in the United States and around the world. So traffickers can really be almost anyone, sadly.
There are several offices within the federal government that are focused on combating human trafficking. What makes your office unique? And how do we know that you guys are working together and there's no duplication of effort?
Yeah, that's a really important question on the coordination and duplication of effort. So when Congress passed the Trafficking Victim Protection Act in 2000, it created a coordinating body to make sure that the federal government is working together. That is called the President's Interagency Task Force to Monitor and Combat Human Trafficking. That is now comprised of 20 different federal departments and agencies so that we all work together and coordinate well our anti-trafficking efforts, both at home and abroad. And that is a cabinet level meeting that meets at the White House annually to really coordinate those efforts. The Secretary of State chairs that task force, so we have an important role in helping coordinate those efforts within our office and supporting the Secretary of State in that role. We have a variety of roles that we play within our office. First and foremost, the State Department's mission is diplomacy. So our core work is working with other governments around the world, with international organizations, civil society, other experts to fight human trafficking and care for victims globally, help build the capacity and raise awareness of other governments and other institutions around the world. We also produce an annual report on human trafficking where we assess government efforts across 188 countries and territories, including the United States. And we have foreign assistance programs where, again, we help build the capacity of both governments and civil society to address the crime and protect victims.
And we talked about, the private sector with some social media companies and internet companies. What else can the private sector do, the nonprofit sector, and just regular citizens do?
That is such an important question because we all have a role to play. First and foremost, governments have responsibilities. Most of us have taken commitments both to our citizens and our own laws, but also international commitments that we've taken to fight the crime. Civil society, as I mentioned, plays a hugely important role in helping identify and provide services. In the United States, almost all of our services for trafficking victims, even those that are funded by the U.S. government, are actually provided for by civil society, nonprofit organizations. The private sector, as you said, does have a really important role to play to make sure that it is not perpetuating human trafficking. And there's an increasing focus on and commitments to understanding their own supply chains, which is not easy, and we know that, but it's really important. We, the U.S. government, also have some real commitments to make sure that we're not purchasing goods and services that have any human trafficking in our own supply chains as well.
Kari, thank you so much for the work that you do and for being on the program.
Thank you so much, Mimi, for raising awareness about this important issue.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.